Now, often in the lead up to Remembrance Day, one of the questions that I will ask myself is what would I do if there was another world war? What would I do if there was a World War III and I was called up to fight? How would I feel? How would I respond? In World War I, there was a range of different responses to the news that Britain was entering into the war. But one of them was this great sense of patriotic fervour. So, for example, when Lord Kitchener called for 200,000 men to sign up to fight in the first month, 300,000 responded. During the course of the war, as many as 250,000 who were not officially old enough to fight managed to sign up, the youngest being a Sidney Lewis, who was only 12 years old. Imagine that, just a 12-year-old boy signing up to fight for his country. I read a letter that an excited 15-year-old, Cyril Josie, wrote to his sister having joined up. And in this letter, you can sense how excited he is about having just been commissioned with his own rifle and bayonet and the prospect of war and the glory of fighting. In World War I, 65 million people from 30 different countries took part in the conflict. And 17 million people, 7 million civilians, and 10 million military personnel were killed. Over 19,000 British soldiers lost their lives in one day in the Battle of the Somme. Cyril, that 15-year-old lad who was so excited about fighting in the war, he survived the war, he got through to the other side, but his experiences during the war turned his initial excitement into extreme bitterness. Now, if there was another world war, if there was a World War III, and I was called up to fight, for me, it would be one of the worst things imaginable. I can't think of many things that are worse. And Psalm 46 is about what someone who has a real and a personal relationship with God can know in the worst of situations. It's a psalm about what someone can know who has a relationship with God in the worst of situations. You probably noticed that the psalm divides up into 3 stanzas, and we're going to look at each stanza in turn. And you can see from the first part, from verses 1 to 3, that these verses are about a worst case scenario. A worst case scenario. So verse 1 starts with God and starts with a statement, and it says that God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, it says in verse 2, we will not fear even if such and such happens. Now, the example that's being given in verses 2 and 3 is not a real-life situation. It's merely, I think, the psalmist imagining what a worst-case scenario would be for him. And he's saying that even if the worst-case scenario happened, still we will not fear. And for him, as he describes it, the worst thing possible happening would be for the mountains to be swallowed up and overcome by the sea. Now, mountains in Bible times were the very epitome of reliability and dependability, and something that you could trust in. It kind of gave you a sense of peace and security, because there are lots of uncertainties in life. There are lots of things that change, but the mountains are always the same. And so mountains in the Bible were a picture of reliability and dependability and security. So, for example, imagine if you lived up in Scotland, and in Scotland, as everywhere else, there are lots of things that come and go. There are lots of uncertainties. There are lots of things that change. But one thing that you can always rely on, and that is when you wake up in the morning and you pull back the curtains, Ben Nevis will always be there. You can rely on that because nothing shifts. Mountains are immovable. They've been there all through the ages, and if there is one thing that naturally you can depend on, and that is mountains. Now, the sea in Bible times was the complete opposite. The sea was not dependable. The sea was not reliable. While a mountain was an image of security, the sea was a force of chaos. It was uncontrollable. It was untamable. It was wild. It was to be feared. And so the author in verses 2 and 3, he's imagining a worst case scenario. The earth giving way and the mountains being moved into the heart of the sea. The waters roaring and foaming and the mountains trembling at its swelling. He's imagining what he fears the most, taking away what he depends on the most. Imagine if what you most depend on was taken away from you. Imagine if what you most feared and dreaded came true. So you think back to the introduction and to World War I, and you think perhaps of wives back home in the UK, and they hear that their husbands have been killed in the fighting, and their worst fears are realized. Their worst fears come true. And that one person that they've depended on, their rock, has been swallowed up and overcome and taken away by the war. And maybe your worst case scenario would be for a family member, a husband or a wife passing away, someone that you've loved and you've lived with and you've depended on for years, and now they're no longer there. Maybe your worst case scenario would be for your health to be taken away. Suddenly being diagnosed with a serious or a terminal illness. Maybe what you have most depended on has been taken away by what you most fear, and I'm so sorry for that. And yet I want you to look at the heart and the mindset of this psalm. And notice what this psalmist says. And notice that he says that even if the worst case scenario happens, still he would not fear. Now, he's not being glib or flippant. He's not trivializing any sense of pain or hurt or loss. He's not saying that he's hard-hearted and he doesn't really care and he's not really touched or he's not moved or affected. No, what he's saying is that he has a rock that can never be taken away. He has a rock that can be never swallowed up or overcome. And look at where the psalmist starts. He starts with God. He starts with the God who is always there, who can always be relied on, who can always be depended on. And as we look at these first three verses, we see that for the people of God, there are three things that you can know and experience with God. And the first is, He is your refuge. He is your refuge. The psalm says, God is our refuge. Do you know God as your refuge? Now, of course, knowing God and having God as your refuge, it doesn't mean that you won't face any storms or troubles in your life. But what it does mean is that you will be sheltered in those storms. I have a look at verse 7 and verse 11. It describes God there not just as your refuge, but as your fortress. For reasons we'll look at in a moment, I think the context and the whole setting and theme of this psalm is one of war. And I want you to imagine that you are involved in trench warfare in World War I. There were 25,000 miles of trenches that were dug in World War I, and the average life expectancy for a soldier who was in the trenches was 42 days. And I would have hated to have been involved in trench warfare and have had to go over the top of the trenches and run towards the enemy, having to run into the face of enemy fire. And yet for the people in the trenches who had a real and a personal relationship with God, they could say that they had a refuge and a place of safety. They could say that God was their fortress and their protection. Not that meant that their lives were guaranteed to be physically preserved as if the bullets would miraculously evade them or swerve around them, but if they were to die, they knew that they would be safe in Jesus and that they were going to heaven. And you know, if you have come to know God through Jesus Christ, His Son, this is what you can say. You can say that the eternal God is your refuge. You can say that in terms of the most important things in life and eternity, you are safe. You are going to heaven. God has saved you. He is your refuge. The second thing that God is to his people is strength. God is our refuge and strength. During the Blitz in World War II, from the 7th of September 1940, London was bombed, I think it was for 57 nights in succession. And you can only imagine, aside from the danger and the loss of life, how draining that period must have been. Night after night after night of bombing that never seemed to come to an end. Maybe you've personally been in the past, or maybe you are in now in a horrible situation, and it feels like you're in this long tunnel and there is no light at the end of the tunnel, and it's just ongoing, and it's so tiring and it's so draining. Maybe you feel a bit like that about lockdown. Maybe there is that illness that you are going through, or that loved one is going through, and they're battling with it, but it just never seems to go away. How do you cope? How do you keep going? Well, here we find that God is not just our refuge, but he's our strength. God is able to enable you to keep going when you feel like you can't. In Isaiah 40, it includes some amazing pictures that describes God's strength. So, for example, he holds the waters of this world in the hollow of his hand. And he weighs the mountains on the scales, and he counts the nations of this world as being like drops of water in the bucket. He is the everlasting God who never sleeps or grows weary. And then it comes to the end of the chapter, and it says this. It says that those who wait upon the Lord, it says that those who trust in him in their situation and depend on him and look to him, they shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. God is able to keep you going as you trust in him and look to him. And then you see the third thing that God is to his people here, and that is he's a help. He's a help. And he's not just a help, but he's a very present help in trouble. A very present help speaks of how God is very ready to help, and that his help is sufficient. It is more than enough. So, for example, when you break down, your car breaks down at the side of the road, and perhaps you're a member of the RAC or the AA, and you phone them up, and of course they're very willing to help, they're eager to help, you're one of their members, but their response time on average is apparently 35 minutes. You have to wait for them to come to you to help, and even then they can't always help you, they can't fix your car. But God is a very present help in trouble. Now God can and does help us sometimes in completely changing and transforming our situation. So sometimes we're in a horrible situation, it's so difficult, it's so hard, and God so wonderfully helps us in completely changing the situation so we don't have to go through it anymore. But more often than not, he helps us not so much by changing the situation, but by enabling us to go through it, giving us strength and peace in it. At a men's meal I went to once, the speaker shared how he became a Christian. He wasn't from a church background. His parents weren't Christians. But one of the things that had an impact on him was visiting a Christian couple and their baby who was in hospital, and the baby had a very serious life-threatening condition. And he said it was the peace that this couple had in one of the worst kinds of situations, and the obvious supernatural help that was being given to them to enable them to go through it, that had such an impact on him. And you've experienced things like that as well, haven't you? God being a very present help in times of trouble, giving you peace, knowing that he is with you. And so this psalmist, he's saying in these first 3 verses, he's saying even in a worst case scenario, we will not fear. because God is our refuge and our strength, and he's a very present help in trouble. And then we come to the second stanza of this psalm, verses 4 to 7. And here we're shown that God is in control. God is in control. Now, the reason why this person is talking about a worst case scenario is because he and God's people, they're already going through a really troubling situation. And the situation, I think, is that they are under attack. A war is raging around them. I think a physical conflict is the setting of this psalm. So you remember the references in verses 7 and 11 to fortress. In verse 9, it speaks about bows and spears and chariots. It speaks of wars one day coming to an end. When it describes nations raging and kingdoms tottering in verse 6, that is war language. And in verses 4 and 5, a siege is being alluded to. Now, sieges were terrible, where an enemy surrounds your city and tries to starve the city to death. When Genghis Khan besieged the city of Yenking, surrounded this city with his armies, cut off their supplies, the suffering got so bad and the future looked so bleak that one evening, as Genghis Khan, as he was looking out towards the city, he saw 60,000 girls, all dressed in white. They climbed up to the top of the city walls, and I think they held hands all together, and as one, they threw themselves off the city walls to their death. It's what's become known historically as an event called falling petals, such a beautiful name to describe such a terrible thing. You see, that's how bad it is when you are at the mercy of an enemy that is camped outside of the gates of your city that is besieging you. Now, when a city was under siege and the enemy was camped all around trying to starve you out, what was absolutely vital was that your water supplies weren't cut off. So if there was a river that could keep supplying the city with water, then the city could keep going for months, if not indefinitely, and they could last out the siege. So you remember King Hezekiah and Assyria is threatening Jerusalem. And Hezekiah, he has that tunnel built to protect their water supplies and to deprive the Assyrians of that water supply. And to see the river still flowing, still giving drinking water to the city, it made the inhabitants inside the city glad. It cheered them. And so I think the scene in verses 4 and 5 is of Jerusalem under attack. God's Old Testament people trapped in the city under siege. And yet there is this river that keeps on flowing. There is this river that keeps them going, and it makes them glad. And of course, this river in this psalm is not a literal river, it's a picture of God. God is the river. And knowing that God is in the midst of their situation with them was making them glad. In fact, the word glad means to rejoice. They were rejoicing to know that God was with them. And you notice the great contrast that is going on in this psalm. So in verse 2, it speaks of even mountains being moved. In verse 6, it speaks of even mighty kingdoms tottering and falling. And yet in verse 5, it speaks of God's people, and they're in a serious and in an awful situation, and yet there is this stability about them. They are not moved. And the reason why they are not moved and there is this stability about them is because they know that God is in control. And look at verse 5. They know that God is able to help them, and he will help them. This situation, it will not last forever. At the right time, at the time that God decrees, it will come to an end. And look at verse 6. They know that though the nations are raging and the kingdoms are falling, all God has to do is speak and it will be finished. So the God who spoke this world into being, who said, "Let there be light," and there was light, he's able to speak and he's able to reverse all that this earth had sadly become. In verse 7 is the assurance that the Lord of hosts is with his people. A massive army is described as a host, a great host of soldiers, but here the Lord is described as the Lord of hosts. He's the Lord who leads the armies of heaven, the angels of heaven. There is no threat that can ever outnumber God. And so he is the fortress of his people, verse 7. They can rejoice because they know he's in control. They can have peace and safety in him. You say, well, what about now? This psalm is in the Old Testament. It was written before Jesus came. It's picturing physical armies attacking a physical Jerusalem in the physical land of Israel where God said that he will be. Well, in the New Testament, Jesus explained that it's different, that God is with his people wherever they are in the world. And whatever they go through or face, verse 5, they too will not be moved. You can apply this psalm to a whole range of situations. So maybe there is a Christian you know and something dreadful has happened in their life, a serious illness, a problem with one of their children, a terrible accident. And of course that they're not careless about it, they're not indifferent to it. You've seen their pain, you've shared their tears, you've sat with them in silence, you've put your arm around them. It's affected them deeply, but it hasn't rocked them in quite the same way that it would rock someone who doesn't know the Lord. There is this stability about them. And that's because they know that the God who is with them is in control. Life for them is not just a world of chaos and cruel events. It's in the hands of the one who they know is reigning over all things. So they're not moved in terms of though they don't know what tomorrow holds, they know the one who holds tomorrow. And maybe you're someone this evening who's not a Christian. And I want to ask you, how do you go through life without the Lord being your refuge, being safe in him? What peace do you have? What comfort do you have? Come to know the Lord who can be that eternal place of safety. Come to know the Lord who is in control of all things. And so we come to the last stanza, the last part, verses 8 to 11. And we see in this part that God will be exalted. God will be exalted. On the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, hostilities ceased on the Western Front. Well, if you look in verse 8 of this psalm, you see that we are allowed to see ahead of time the day when wars will cease for good. Verse 9, when wars will cease to the end of the earth. When God will break the bow and shatter the spear. When he will burn the chariots in fire, when bullets and bombs and fighter jets and warships and cyber warfare will be a thing of the past. Now, we often primarily apply verse 10 as a verse of comfort for the Christian in the middle of a storm. The comfort of being still and knowing God and knowing him with you. Whatever storm is raging around you. And of course, that is absolutely true. And for the Christian, verse 10 is a great comfort. And in Christ, you can be still and know God with you. And yet, that's not primarily the meaning of verse 10. Verse 10 primarily is directed towards a restless world. It is a rebuke to a wild and restless world. So think of it like this. You are There is a classroom of children, and it's just chaos in the classroom. It's wild, it's unruly. The children, they're not obeying the teacher. In fact, they've forgotten that the teacher is there, and they're just doing what they want. And paper is flying about all over the place. They're throwing things at each other. Chairs are being scattered. Computers are being broken. The children, they're fighting each other. They're shouting at each other. It's just carnage. And then suddenly the teacher shouts quiet. And instantly there is peace. And these children stop. And they give to the teacher the place that she deserves. They acknowledge her and they respond to her and they stop. And I think that that's a bit more of what's going on in verse 10. You think of Jesus in the boat on the Lake of Galilee in Mark 4. And the wind is howling and the storm is bashing against the sides of the ship. And there's something strange going on. There's something dark and unruly that seems to be happening. On the surface, creation itself seems to be trying to drown the Creator. Something is not right in that scene. And you remember what Jesus does. The disciples, they wake him, they're scared, they're scared they're going to drown, and they wake him and they say, Master, don't you care that we're going to drown? And Jesus, he gets up and he rebukes the wind, and he says, peace, be still to the sea. And suddenly there is this great calm. And the wind drops and the sea flattens. And the disciples who were terrified during the storm, they're even more afraid now, and they ask each other, who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? And of course the answer is that this man is the God of Psalm 46. Jesus is the God of Psalm 46. You see, at the moment, this earth, it does not exalt God. The nations, they do not exalt God. They do not acknowledge him. The first great command is to love God with all that you are. But God is not listened to. God is not exalted. God is not acknowledged. The second great command is to love your neighbor as yourself. But as you can see from this psalm, instead there are wars and there's conflict and hostility and there's fighting. And yet, like the teacher in the classroom, one day, verse 10, God is going to say, enough is enough. He's going to say, peace, be still, and know that I'm God. He's going to say, I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. And all wars will come to an end. All crimes will cease, and all humanity will be humble before him. And in one sense, verse 10 is a terrifying day. It's describing the day of judgment when evil will be dealt with. It's describing that day when those who have caused conflicts will be judged. Whether that's a big conflict between two nations or whether that's a small conflict between two people. It's describing the day when all conflicts will be stopped and when all guilty parties will be held to account. You think of all the wars that you've been involved in, all the conflicts you've started, the war of words that you've had with someone, the different battles that you've fought as you've tried to get your own way, the way in which you've injured people or hurt people. And so in one sense, actually, this is a terrifying day. And yet in another sense, for those who have humbled themselves already before God, who have come to know God as their refuge and fortress, who have asked God for forgiveness and mercy and cleansing, who have a real relationship with the Lord, this day, verse 10, is a day to look forward to. Because God is their God. That's the theme of this psalm. He's our God. Jesus has faced the judgment for them. He is their refuge and their fortress for all eternity. And they can now look forward to this day when all that hurts them and harms them, when all conflicts will be brought to an end. And as they look forward to that final day, they can be still and know that he is God. And they can have peace in him as they wait quietly in him.